Good morning, everyone. I hope this video finds you well. My name is David Haydon. I'm an alumnus of the MFA program at Western Kentucky University. The presentation you're about to listen to is titled Fragmenting Fatherhood, Nonlinear Memoir's Articulation of the Effects of Toxic Fatherhood. This research stems from my own difficulties writing about my father. So over the past year, I've been reading and rereading memoirs focused on or ones that include elements about child-father relationships. I proposed this presentation with just a bit of research, but in the months since, I've come to realize there is just very little research about memoirs and fatherhood, particularly literary memoirs. So this research is an attempt to begin filling that gap, and as such, it's really in an early phase. I look forward to discussing it with you in a Q&A and kind of learning more about my own research. In this presentation, I'm going to be discussing Dinty Moore's Between Panic and Desire and Lydia Yuknovich's The Chronology of Water. These narratives flout the typical father-child narrative because in writing about fathers and fatherhood in nonlinear ways, I argue that these texts fragment fatherhood by destabilizing the unified character of their particular father and in the process demonstrating the ways in which fathers and children are both harmed by toxic notions of fatherhood. In this presentation, for the sake of time, I'm going to discuss the ways that each text individually operates using nonlinear narrative and then synthesize what this means in the context of the father memoir subgenre as a whole. So in The Chronology of Water, Yuknovich uses fragments as both a more natural form of storytelling and as a means of creating loops, rhythms, and patterns. In the beginning of her memoir, she writes, "I remember things in retinal flashes, without order. Your life doesn't happen in any kind of order. Events don't have cause and effect relationships the way you wish they did. It's all a series of fragments and repetitions and pattern formations. Language and water have this in common." When we apply this framework to her narrative, we see several patterns emerge, one of which is a pattern of stories about her father, his abuse, and her struggle under it. Across these stories, though, we can also see narrative patterns, particularly one that uses time as a way to approach, evade, and disempower the abuse of her father. Yuknovich first writes about her father in On Sound and Silence, in which she describes his actions as a disciplinarian. For her older sister, he had used the crybaby corner, which is fairly self-explanatory, but she explains that the method didn't work for her as she cried at everything. But in actually describing her father, she only talks about his voice. "I had a journal I hid under my bed. I didn't know what a journal was. It was just a red notebook that I wrote pictures and true things and lies in interchangeably. I wrote about my father's angry, loud voice, how I hated it, how I wished I could kill it." Later in Father, she says, "Before my father's hands moved against us, he was an architect, lover of art. His hands, I remember his hands at work over great expanses of paper, rows and rows of pens and pencils. In both of these moments, Yuknovich hovers around or skirts the edge of narrativizing this abuse, but instead of delivering the narrative of the abuse, she allows the narrative to enter an undercurrent, something we didn't see that delivers us to a different vantage point. Such a nonlinear depiction of violence allows us to recognize the pattern, always slipping away. In the slippage between events and narrative, Yuknovich controls the narrative of her father's abuse. She fractures his authority. In the parts of him, Yuknovich constitutes a fatherhood based on power. In the culmination of these fragments, she writes, "He drew up his full height of father and pulled his arm back and fisted up his hand until it white-knuckled and his face went red. And I leaned in as close to his face as I could and I said, 'Do it.' It was his voice I used." In this moment, Yuknovich brings us the closest she can to abuse after luring us in and out. In doing so, she provides a model for resisting dominant linear discourse, like that of the authority of the father. This resistance creates holes that formally enact the gaps created in her life by her father's abuse. Such resistance demonstrates the inadequacies of the model of fatherhood practiced upon her. Instead, in what remains, as I will discuss later, she rejects notions of fatherhood while offering alternatives to a dominant narrative of fatherly power. Like Yuknovich, Moore uses scene as a loop in Between Panic and Desire. But unlike her, his loops deliver transformations of the same scene, not towards a resolution in a linear sense, but towards greater understanding. Moore uses a nonlinear structure to return to the same scene of his father drunk at the bar or stumbling home from the bar at least three times, at least in a similar configuration, not always the same exact scene. But he does this in the essays Son of Mr. Green Jeans, Son of Richard M. Nixon, and Son of George McManus. I want to summarize the cycle here and its significance. In The Son of Mr. Greenjeans, Moore uses an alphabetical, encyclopedic form in which he writes entries with slants that discuss fatherhood. In this essay, he juxtaposes his own experience as a child of his father with various discourses about fatherhood, biological information about Japanese carp, and emperor penguins, for example. In Son of Mr. Greenjeans, Moore has a thread dedicated to fathers and genetics that runs through several of the entries. And in the entry titled Inheritance, he initiates the bar scene and says the following about his father. And I've chosen here to quote at length so as not to necessitate it for each of the repetitions in the Son of essays. So he says, "By the time I entered the scene, my father was spending every evening visiting the working class bars. Most nights he would stumble back drunk around midnight. Some nights he was so drunk he would stumble through a neighbor's back door thinking he was home. Our phone would ring, 'You'd better come get him.' As a boy, I coped with this embarrassment by staying glazed to the television. Shows like Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver were my favorites. I desperately wanted someone like Hugh Beaumont to be my father, or maybe Robert Young. This scene, the father stumbling home drunk, is met with embarrassment and shame, expected of a young boy. The narrative attached to it, the logic is one in which substitution is desired. The father is not ideal, and therefore should be replaced by one that is." As the Son of essays continue, however, Moore's desires transform from one of substitution to something else entirely. After reading the essays and recognizing their looping nature, we begin to see that they are an act of transformation, that Moore's desires change with each consecutive revisioning of the scene of his drunken father returning home. In Son of Richard M. Nixon, Moore writes, "The clearest memory I have of my father from those years just after Kennedy's assassination is the sound of the back screen door squeaking open. These midnight sounds meant my father had arrived home safely and all would be well. Then, in Son of Gerald McManus, George McManus, Moore figures his parents as the characters of McManus's comic strip, Bringing Up Father. He writes, "My parents' adult lives turned out to be an ironic reemergence of the old comic stereotype. Maggie, the wife, hounding Jiggs to stay home, to be a family man, pay attention to the children, fix the faucet, stop all that drinking with ne'er-do-well friends in the low-class dives. McManus had them nailed." These three essays each expand the same scene, the same drama. Moore's relationship to his father is framed by the man's alcoholism. Between Greenjeans and Richard M. Nixon, the narrator Moore matures to a point where the drunken return of his father was an embarrassment, at least not primarily, but rather the son felt relief his father was home and safe. Potentially a consequence of losing JFK as a father figure in his assassination, Moore becomes recommitted or reattached to his father. From Richard M. Nixon to George McManus, Moore begins to internalize the relationship. Dinty Moore was the name of the bartender in McManus's comic, a source of contention between Jiggs and Maggie, read as Moore's parents. Maggie doesn't want Jiggs hanging out with him. He writes of this name, "Why in heaven's name would a woman knowingly name her son after a comic strip character whose chief activity was luring respectable fellows out of their homes to drink beer and play cards?" This return to the bar scene, and I don't do this justice here because of time, but his father's absence during his birth figures it as a key part of his identity, but with no answer. Was this intentional on his mother's part? If so, why? So through these narratives, both narrators have presented their fathers textually as unstable composites, unified only by the term father and the authority that accompanies it. They aren't kind of these TV fathers who are simultaneously loving and authoritative. They're just authoritative. So what I mean by this is that both memoirs seek to deconstruct the father as a way of accessing the interior, rather than accepting the smooth exterior that requires both father and child to forego any form of intimate connection. In presenting absent fathers in contemporary memoir, one of the few, if not only, systematic studies of memoirs about fathers, G. Thomas Cowser argues this literature is mainly driven not by the desire to memorialize a beloved or admired father, but by the impulse to compensate for or repair a flawed relationship. That is, the books are best read not as static representations of fathers, whether favorable or not. Indeed, very few are successful at rendering their subjects as complex human beings, but rather as attempts to claim or even fashion a relationship with a father who is somehow absent. Kauser argues that memoir cannot recount historically or accurately the personal relationship between father and child, and instead posits that current memoir of the father seems to aggrandize the memoir itself while degrading the father. As such, he argues the literary strategies of memoir, and specifically memoir about the father, present logical, ontological, and even psychological fallacies inherent to the genre, especially when compared to biographies about men with children. I, however, argue that the father memoir genre, or at least the literary father memoir, is less concerned with reconstituting or fashioning a relationship as it is with interrogating the one that existed. In fact, both Yuknavitch and Moore swear off such redemptive or reconciliatory resolutions. They aren't trying to solve the problem that they had with their father. Yuknavitch comments that after Priest says she lied about her father's abuse, and after reading about Joan of Arc, she, quote, left belief to the house of father forever. And Moore, in the last chapter of his memoir, writes about a dream in which he meets his father at a Chinese restaurant. He writes one ending in which his father says, "Dinty, my boy, you shouldn't have had to suffer all that gloom and confusion. Let me say right here that I'm sorry. It's all my fault, and I love you more than anything. Still do." But Moore quickly tells us this is a fabricated ending. Instead, he says, "I kissed my father on his stubbly cheek and must have rolled over in bed or something because the dream stopped. Right there. We were simply grateful to see one another." If these memoirs eschew the reconciliatory, that kind of happy narrative of father, the creation of a relationship with their father that might replace the one that they've lived with, what then do their texts actually achieve? I argue that their texts fragment the father they did live with, as I demonstrated earlier, and instead attempt to engage with their father that was a person before becoming their father, and that's what I'm about to explain here. The use of literary devices, particularly nonlinear narrative, allows the father to become a father with something, or a father who did something at one point. What I mean by this is that fathers as textually presented are more complex than their children were ever given access to, often within the same textual space where they were violent or absent. Yuknavitch achieves this in the same essay that she writes of her father's violent hands. In Father, she writes, "Before my father's hands moved against us, he was an architect, lover of art. Before my father was an architect, he was a navigator in the Korean War. Before my father was a navigator, he was an artist. Before my father was an artist, he was an athlete. Before my father was an athlete, he was an unhappy altar boy. That's the best I can do, I think. Let me try again." In this essay, Yuknavitch reckons with the fact that her father was, and arguably still is, or has inside of him these identities, these things. Upon trying again, she writes a short narrative about each identity her father holds or has held. She writes beautifully about them, about his architectural sketches and his ability to tell stories about famous architectural homes. She talks about a magnificent red bird he drew, his grand slam as a baseball player in high school. She holds all these things as truth at once, that he is an abuser and every other identity he holds. In her final move in the essay, she says, "That's as far as I can go. To go further into his story, it takes the air right out of my lungs. Before my father was my father, he was a boy. Just a boy. Before I hated him, I loved him." This recognition of her father's identities does not negate her other narratives, does not redeem him in any way. Instead, she shows us alternatives, or kind of what I like to call kinetic energy, what he could have been, other ways that he could have existed had he not been an abuser. Yet we must hold him with all of his identities as a textually unstable father. A father capable of more, full of kinetic energy, but that energy goes kind of wasted because he didn't fulfill that more complicated fatherhood role. So both Yuknavitch and Moore articulate a man behind the facade of father, and unfortunately I didn't have time to talk about Moore's achievement of that, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. But they're interested in the fragments, the incomplete, partial images of the man they called their fathers. Kauser argues that the father memoir is weakened by the tendency of memoirists to fail to reckon with their fathers' lives prior to fatherhood. He writes, "Children come to exist only after a good portion of their father's lives is over. They thus have no direct experience of their father's formative and, in some case, best and happiest years. Yet Yuknovich and Moore both look at their father's lives before they became fathers and reflect on it with desire," right? Between panic and desire. They are not aware of their father's identities besides father as a child, but as memoirs they are interested in the possibility of these fragments. What would fatherhood mean if it was contingent upon an intimate relationship between child and the complex multiple identities of their fathers? That's the question these texts are really asking.